The heat that summer sat on Calhoun County like a hand pressing down, and the people who gathered at the Tanner Feed and Supply that Thursday afternoon in late July did not look like a crowd awaiting a verdict so much as a crowd awaiting a sentence already passed. They stood in the gravel lot under the corrugated awning, 40 or 50 of them, ranchers and their wives, the county extension agent, 2 men in clean shirts from the Meridian Agricultural Consortium, whose badges caught the flat, white light. And they all faced a woman standing in the bed of a mud-crusted pickup truck with a notebook in one hand and nothing particular to prove to anyone. The air smelled of creosote and distant smoke and something green and faintly mineral that most of them could not quite name, though they would come to know that smell very well before the week was out. Nobody spoke. Even the consortium men had gone still. They had come expecting a negotiation. What they found instead was an ending they had not written for themselves, and the stillness of the crowd was the stillness of people trying to understand when exactly the story had changed underneath them. The woman in the truck bed looked out over the lot and let the silence hold another 10 seconds, and then she opened the notebook and said she had some numbers to share with them, and her voice did not shake even a little, because she had run these numbers so many times in the dark before dawn that they had become a kind of prayer. But the real verdict had not been rendered that Thursday. It had been rendered 14 months earlier, by 78 goats and 80 acres of drowned bottomland that nobody in Calhoun County wanted, and by a woman who was willing to listen to both. Her name was Cecilia Voss, and she had arrived in the county on a raw Wednesday in May the previous year, driving a truck she owned and pulling a small trailer she had borrowed from her brother-in-law, and carrying in a canvas satchel the sum of $11,200 in certified checks and a paper deed to a parcel that the county had seized. For unpaid taxes 3 years running, the parcel was known locally as the Dillard Swamp, though the Dillards had not owned it in 30 years, and the word swamp was being generous in some respects and precise in others. It was 80 acres of saturated bottomland in the southwestern corner of the county, where Persimmon Creek backed up against a clay ridge and had nowhere polite to go. So it spread itself across the ground in a thin seasonal sheet and encouraged sedge and cattail and tupelo gum and the particular species of mud that swallowed a boot hole and kept the boot. The upland county understood this land as a failure, a drainage problem wearing the legal costume of a real estate parcel, and the county had taken it back from its last owner, not because the county wanted it, but because the law left no other option. When Cecilia Voss had offered $11,000 at the county tax sale that April, she had been the only bidder, and the county clerk had looked at her over his glasses with an expression that stopped just short of concern. She had paid $11,200 for the land itself. She had spent the remaining portion of what she had, which was $940, on a month's lease, on a set of portable fence panels and a stock trailer rental to bring the goats from a dispersal sale 2 counties over where a retiring couple was liquidating their herd. She had bought 78 of them, a mixed herd of Boer crosses and Kiko crosses, and 1 elderly purebred Nubian buck she had not intended to purchase, but whose eyes, she would say later, had simply asked her to. She had paid on average $12.15 per head for animals the auctioneer had described as motley, which was charitable, and which the one other interested party, a dogger buying for a rendering broker, had dismissed as hardly worth his diesel. She had outbid him by $1 a head, and felt in the moment either very brave or very stupid, and was not yet certain which. By the time she unloaded the last of the goats onto the Dillard property on a Thursday evening and stood in the haze of their collective breath, watching them fan out into the sedge, she had $48 left in her checking account, a leaking stock tank she had found on the property, and no income of any kind. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. The portable fence panels were leased only through August. Her truck needed 2 tires by October. She had no health insurance and a mild heart condition she took 1 prescription medication for, and the prescription would need refilling in 6 weeks. $48. She wrote that number at the top of a clean page in her notebook and drew a line under it and stared at it a while. Then she wrote the date and the number of goats and the acreage and went to sleep in the cab of her truck because she had not yet erected the small wall tent she had brought. The town heard about the purchase within 3 days, as towns do. The feed store got the news first because Cecilia had gone in for a 50-pound bag of loose mineral salt, and the man behind the counter, whose name was Fitzgundry, and who had operated the store for 22 years and considered himself a reliable gauge of agricultural common sense, had asked her what she was running out on the old Dillard place. When she told him goats, he had not laughed. He had done something almost worse, which was to remain perfectly courteous and very briefly close his eyes before ringing up her purchase, as though absorbing a small private grief on her behalf. By evening, the feed store version of the story had traveled to the diner and acquired embellishments, and by the following Wednesday, at the monthly meeting of the Calhoun County Cattlemen's Association, the story had become representative of something larger, which was the incomprehensible decisions made by people who moved into a county from elsewhere and did not have the good sense to ask anybody anything before they lost their money. A man named Dale Tufts, who ran 600 head of Angus on the river bottom north of town, and who had never in his adult life been accused of undercompetence, said flatly that she would be sold out by September, and he said it with the resigned authority of a man describing the weather. He was not cruel about it. That was the thing Cecilia would think about later, in the months when she had cause to think about these early days. None of them were cruel, precisely. They were just certain, the way a community becomes certain about the natural order of things, when the natural order has confirmed their expectations often enough. Swampland was swampland. Goats were the animal of last resort. A woman alone with no background in livestock that anyone in town could discover, buying the county's most spectacularly waterlogged acreage and stocking it with the cheapest animals at a dispersal sale, was not a story with a favorable ending. They were not rooting against her. They simply knew, the way they knew which direction Persimmon Creek ran, what the outcome would be. In June, the Meridian Agricultural Consortium sent a man named Gerald Pratt to her property. Gerald Pratt was 43, trim, well-spoken, and wore a straw hat with a brim, so even it seemed to have been cut by a machine, and he drove a company truck so clean it looked painful on a gravel road. He stood at her gate and introduced himself with a firm handshake and a card, and explained that Meridian was quietly assembling contiguous parcels in the southwestern quarter of the county for a watershed management and agricultural development plan, that the Dillard parcel fit neatly into their footprint, and that they were prepared to offer her $14,000 for the 80 acres, which he acknowledged was above her acquisition cost, and which he presented as a generous opening position. He said this in the tone of a man who expects gratitude for the accuracy of his arithmetic. Cecilia looked at the card and then at Gerald Pratt and said she was not interested in selling. He said he understood, that the offer stood, and that she should call the number on the card if her circumstances changed. He said, circumstances in a particular way, measured and sympathetic, that carried inside it the assumption that they would. She did not call. She did not think about the card again until Gerald Pratt reappeared. Twice more in the months that followed. What she thought about through June and into July was water and browse and the arithmetic of survival, which was the phrase she had begun writing at the top of each page in her notebook as a kind of header, a way of reminding herself that every decision needed to clear a minimum threshold before she was entitled to think about anything else. The arithmetic of survival. She wrote it so many times that the phrase wore a groove in her thinking, and she began to believe it worked in reverse as well, meaning that survival, the plain daily fact of remaining solvent and fed and functional, was itself a form of arithmetic, and that if she could keep the numbers straight, the goats taught her the property faster than any survey could have. She had run temporary fencing in a rough perimeter and was moving the herd in managed rotations, which she had read about but never practiced, and the goats were not cooperating with her mental map of the land, because the land's mental map of itself was different from any map she had made. The saturated section she had marked as dead zones, The areas where the water stood ankle-deep and the ground was sour, the goats avoided as she expected, but they were finding routes along elevated spines of clay and through gallery corridors of willow she had not noticed. And following these routes to browse, she had not accounted for in her carrying capacity estimates. They were eating greenbrier and wax myrtle and young willow tips and the tender shoots of species she did not have names for, doing it efficiently and with enormous selectivity, moving through the wetter sections with a nimble distaste, and returning always to sleep on the dry ridges. They knew things about the land she did not know yet, and she began following them, rather than directing them, and this reversed the whole arrangement of her initial plan. The elderly Nubian buck whom she had not named, but whom she had begun to think of as the senator for no reason she could clearly defend, had a habit of standing very still on the highest point available to him, which on 80 acres of nearly flat bottomland was sometimes no more than a slight swell in the clay. And, looking southeast with an expression of vast placid deliberation. She noticed this habit because it was so consistent, and because the other animals deferred to him without apparent communication, waiting when he waited, and moving when he moved. She did not assign this meaning immediately. She simply noted it in her notebook, the date and time and direction of his attention, the way a person notes the weather, not because they understand the system, but because they understand that the system is smarter than they are. In her 6th week on the property, she met Orsolia Fekete. Orsolia Fekete was 71 years old and had emigrated from Hungary 40 years earlier, and had farmed the 40 acres adjacent to Cecilia's northern fence line for most of those 40 years. Running a modest market garden operation and a small dairy flock of East Frisian ewes that the county's agricultural community regarded as eccentric but inoffensive. She appeared one morning at Cecilia's north fence with a mason jar of pickled peppers and the directness of a woman who had decided something. She was short and broad-shouldered and wore rubber boots and a cotton headscarf and spoke English with a care that gave each sentence a slightly formal gravity, as though she was aware that the language was borrowed and did not wish to abuse it. She said, "I have watched you following the goats. This is the correct approach." Cecilia thanked her for the peppers and asked what she meant by correct. Orsolia said, "The land holds a ledger. Every stone, every root, every underground movement of water. It has been writing in this ledger for longer than anyone here has been watching. The animal reads the ledger because it must. You cannot read the ledger because you did not grow up here. So you let the animal read it, and you read the animal. This is not weakness. This is the only honest science." She said this with the mild authority of someone describing a thing so obvious that its statement was almost embarrassing. Then she pointed southeast toward the area where the senator had been directing his attention with such stubborn consistency. And she said that in 40 years she had watched that corner of the Dillard parcel after very heavy rain, and that water moved through it differently than it moved through the rest of the bottomland, slower and cleaner, coming up from below rather than draining from above, and that the old man who had owned the property in the 70s had spoken once of a seep, an artesian movement from a limestone formation below the clay that he had tried to dig out and pipe, and given up on when the pipe kept filling with sediment. She said the goats knew the seep was there, because the mineral content of the soil above it was different, the browse was different, and because goats as a species had been finding water in inhospitable places since before any written record of them existed. Cecilia listened to this with her notebook open, but her pen still. Orsolia said, "I am not telling you this so that you will act immediately. I am telling you this so that you will watch. The land whispers to you the thing it has been trying to say for 30 years. You must only be quiet enough to hear it." Cecilia wrote the word seep in her notebook and a date, and Orsolia's phrase verbatim, underlining the last sentence twice. She did not act immediately. She watched. The boy appeared in late July. His name was Tomas. He was 9 years old. He lived with his mother and 2 younger siblings in a rented double-wide on the gravel road that ran along the county right-of-way on the east side of Cecilia's fence, and he appeared one afternoon on the fence rail with no particular introduction, watching the goats with the focused attention of a child who has found the thing that makes most sense to him in the world. He did not ask permission. He did not ask questions for the first 3 visits. He simply watched. On the 4th visit, he asked what the old one with the long ears was called, and Cecilia said she called him the senator. And Thomas looked at her with a brief evaluating expression and said that was a good name. He began coming every afternoon after that, and by August he had named 37 of the other animals with a precision and consistency that she could only have managed with a tag gun and a spreadsheet. He called them by their markings and their habits: Patch, Gimble, the General, Miss Tuesday, the one with a torn left ear he called Half Note. He did not come in her way or ask her to entertain him. He helped carry things and hold things, and he moved among the herd without disturbing them, which was the quality that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of quiet he possessed. He came from a family that had been dealt consecutive bad years, as she had gathered from Orsolia, and who could not afford to lose another season's income, and she began paying him in produce from Orsolia's garden, which Orsolia supplied in excess and freely. And this arrangement seemed to satisfy everyone. It was Thomas who came to her on the 3rd morning of September and said the senator was standing in the southeast corner and would not move and had been there since first light. Cecilia walked the fence line to the southeast corner and found the old buck standing with his chin slightly elevated, utterly still, in the faint depression that marked the area Orsolia had described. The ground around his feet was wet in a way that did not correspond to any recent rain. Wet from below, a slow seeping upward through the clay that darkened the soil in a ragged 6-foot circle and smelled different from the standing water elsewhere on the property. Clean, cold, faintly of iron and something older. She knelt and pressed her palm flat to the ground and felt the cold come up through the clay like a pulse. She did not shout. She did not tell anyone. She went back to her tent and sat on her folding crate and wrote the date in her notebook at the top of a new page, and beneath it the phrase, "Arithmetic of Survival," and beneath that, in careful numbers, a first rough estimate of what a working artesian seep, if she could clear the old pipe and expand the outflow, would produce in gallons per day and what that volume might mean for her stock in a dry summer. She wrote the number and looked at it for a long time, and then she wrote the number again to make sure she had not imagined it. Then she closed the notebook and went back to work and told no one except Orsolia, who received the news with a single slow nod and said, "Good. Now you bank it. You keep it low and quiet, like a coal under the ash, and you let it grow in the dark until you know exactly what it is and what it is worth." She spent October and November clearing the old pipe by hand, a 4-inch clay tile drain the previous owner had laid in the mid-70s, blocked at its lower end with 30 years of accumulated sediment and tree root. She did this work at dawn, and in the evenings, when the light was low and the road was empty, and she carted the spoil in a wheelbarrow and spread it in the garden Orsolia had let her establish on the northern high ground. When the pipe cleared, the seep did not gush. It produced a steady, unhurried column of water at a temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the first cold weeks of November, flowing at a rate she measured with a 5-gallon bucket and a watch at approximately 9 gallons per minute, which was 12,960 gallons per day, and which was, by any honest measure, more water than she needed for 78 goats and a kitchen garden and a small dairy operation, if she built one, and considerably more water than any 80 acres of swamp-choked bottomland had any business producing in a county that had been quietly trending drier for the better part of a decade. She built a simple concrete collection basin by January. Working with bags of ready mix she carried in her truck bed 2 at a time from the feed store, so that no single purchase would be large enough to draw comment, she piped the overflow into a stock pond. She shaped by hand with a rented mini excavator over 3 January weekends, and she seeded the pond margins with native plants, and watched the goats drink from it and watched the water move, and tested it with a basic kit she had ordered online, and confirmed what the smell and the temperature and the old man's legend had suggested, The water was clean, mineral-rich, limestone-filtered, and cold, rising from a formation that predated any of the county's agricultural contamination. She wrote all of this in the notebook under a series of dated entries, and she told no one except Orsolia. And she kept the basin screened with willow lattice she had cut from the property. And she kept the goats on the sudden rotations when she knew anyone was on the road. By February, the does were in better condition than they had been at the dispersal sale. She had expected this, partly given the browse improvement and the mineral supplementation from the water, but the degree of improvement was beyond her expectation. Their coats had a density and luster that she recognized as the external signal of a deep nutritional change, and their milk production, in the daws she had begun milking experimentally in January, was higher than breed averages and tasted, to her palate and then to Orsolia's more practiced one, Waller. None like any goat's milk either of them had sampled before, very clean, sweet, with a mineral roundness that reminded Orsolia of a particular regional cheese she had eaten as a child in the Book Hills. Cecilia wrote the milk fat percentages in her notebook alongside the daily water readings and the weight gains, and she looked at the columns of numbers the way you look at a card hand that turned out better than you had any right to expect. The outside validator arrived in March, without any announcement. She was a woman named Rosa Iglesias who ran a specialty food distribution operation out of a city 3 hours south, and who had been driving through the county on an unrelated errand when she stopped at Orsolia's farm stand on the county road, which Orsolia had reopened for the season, and had tasted a soft, fresh cheese Orsolia had made using Cecilia's milk. She had tasted it with the professional attention of someone whose livelihood depends on her ability to distinguish between ordinary and extraordinary. And then she had sat down on Orsolia's porch step and asked, very quietly, where the milk had come from. Orsolia had directed her down the fence line to Cecilia's gate. Rosa Iglesias had tasted the milk directly, still warm from a jar Cecilia had filled that morning, and she had offered on the spot a purchase agreement for all the fresh cheddar Cecilia could produce at a price per pound that made Cecilia write the number down in front of Rosa Iglesias just to confirm she had heard it correctly. The number was 3 times the commodity market rate. Rosa Iglesias said, "Whatever your goats are eating or drinking, it is in the milk, and what is in that milk is the best argument for a premium price I have tasted in 11 years of doing this work." Cecilia shook her hand and signed nothing that day and told Rosa she would need a week to run the numbers. She ran the numbers that night for 4 hours. The arithmetic had changed completely. The $48 she had started with had grown through the winter by careful management and 2 small sales of culled animals into a working reserve of just over $4,000, which was not comfort, but was survival. The milk contract, if she built a small licensed dairy facility and increased her milking herd, would clear her annual operating costs and leave a margin that she had not imagined the property could produce in her most optimistic projections. She signed the contract the following week. First, she bought lumber and built the dairy structure herself over 5 weekends, Tomas handing her boards and holding the level, and she applied for her dairy license through the state agricultural department and received it in May, 14 months after she had arrived in Calhoun County with $11,200 and $48 in change. By June, the county was burning. The drought that arrived that summer was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the data. But data and reality are different things, and the county had been watching its own habits more closely than it had been watching the data. So the drought arrived with the force of a surprise anyway. One coming on like the open door of a furnace left standing in the middle of a road you thought you knew. By the end of June, the county had received 4 inches of rain where it expected 18. By mid-July, the grass on the conventional pastures was gone to brown bristle. Stock ponds on the river bottom. Properties dropped 18 inches in 3 weeks and kept dropping. Fed's Gundry at the feed store sold out of supplemental hay twice before August and had to put customers on a wait list. The county extension agent issued a voluntary destocking advisory, and within 10 days, it became an urgent recommendation. Dale Tufts, who ran 600 head of Angus on the river bottom, lost his northern pond entirely in late July, and began hauling water in a tanker truck at a cost that was ruining him slowly and then quickly. Gerald Pratt reappeared at Cecilia's gate on the 15th of July. He was still trim and still wore the even-brimmed hat, but the hat had a sweat stain now, and the company truck had road dust on it, and he was not quite so arranged about the shoulders as he had been. He said Meridian was now prepared to offer $31,000 for the 80 acres, which was nearly 3 times her acquisition cost. And he said this with the tone of a man who considers the number to be a rescue rather than a transaction. He also said, in the careful way of someone accustomed to using legal proximity as a persuasion tool, that the county was under pressure to review the drainage classification of the southwestern bottomlands, that certain remediation requirements might be triggered, that it was a complex situation, and Meridian had attorneys with experience navigating it, and that their offer was structured in a way that would relieve her of any remediation liability. Cecilia listened to all of this, and then said, "I am not selling $31,000 or $131,000. I am not selling." Gerald Pratt said he was sorry to hear that, and that the offer was time-limited, and that he hoped she would reconsider. He departed. Within the week she heard through Orsolia, and then through Tomas's mother, and then from a direct comment at the feed store, that there was a story circulating in the county suggesting that her goats had been causing erosion damage on the bottomland that was worsening the county's drainage problems. The story was specific enough in its geographical detail that it was clear the person who had introduced it had a specific knowledge of her property, and the story was also completely false, which she knew because the goats' managed rotations had done the opposite of damage. Their browsing, reducing the invasive reed beds that had been impeding water movement for years. And the artesian flow had actually stabilized the soil moisture in the southeastern quadrant. She did not respond to the story publicly. She wrote the date in her notebook and wrote the word rumor, and beneath it the substance of the story, and beneath that the phrase, "Being right is its own kind of reply," and she let it sit. The second wave of Gerald Pratt's attention came through the County Water Board, where Meridian apparently had a connection, in the form of a notice that her artesian pipe discharge might require a water use permit under a provision of the county groundwater ordinance that she was not previously aware of. She drove to the county seat and spent a day in the public records room and established that the provision in question applied to commercial extraction above a specific daily volume threshold, and that her documented discharge rate fell below that threshold by a margin sufficient to make the notice legally groundless. She returned to the property and wrote this determination in her notebook, and filed the paperwork to formalize her existing use rights, and did not hear from the water board again. The drought deepened in August. The county was in genuine distress. Animals were being sold at emergency prices to kill buyers because the feed costs could not be sustained. Families who had farmed in Calhoun County for 3 generations were selling equipment to make payments. The community meetings at the Tanner feed had acquired the compressed, slightly desperate atmosphere of a siege. At the third of these meetings, in late July, Gerald Pratt had attended and presented a Meridian proposal for a county emergency water partnership, in which Meridian would access certain water rights on properties it controlled and distribute water to struggling operations at a fee schedule. As Cecilia read it in the summary document that circulated afterward, would be commercially ruinous for most of the families who needed it most. Meridian framed this as emergency community support. The fee schedule suggested it was infrastructure for a long-term dependency. She read the document twice and wrote a column of numbers in her notebook beside the fee schedule, and was very quiet for several days. On the first Thursday of August, Dale Tufts came to her gate. He was alone, and he had left his truck on the road and walked the lane to her gate on foot, which struck her as deliberate, a posture of approach rather than arrival. He was a large, weathered man of 54, who had never, in her experience, looked uncertain, and he looked uncertain now. He took his hat off when she came to the gate, which she noted. He said he was in a difficult position, and that he wanted to speak plainly. And she said she preferred plain speaking. And he said his northern stock pond was dry, and his southern pond was down to 18 inches of mud water, that he would not give his cattle if he had any alternative, and that his tanker water costs were consuming his operating reserve at a rate he could not sustain past another 3 weeks. He said he had 200 head. He could not move to market at a useful price because the market was flooded with emergency sales. He said he had heard, and he paused here and looked at her directly, that her property still had water. She said that it did. He said he wanted to know if there was any arrangement she would consider, and he said it in the voice of a man asking for something he does not believe he deserves, which was a voice she had not previously heard from Dale Tufts, and which told her more about the severity of the situation than any data point had. She said, "Come back Thursday with your neighbors." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his head back on and said he would. He walked back down the lane to his truck without another word, and she watched him go and then turned back to her goats, who were moving through the evening rotations with the unhurried authority of animals who lived on land that still had water in it. And she thought about what Orsolia had said about the coal kept low under the ash. And she thought the ash had been the right insulation for exactly as long as it needed to be, and now it was time to let the heat have air. On Thursday, the 3rd week of August, which was the afternoon when the heat sat on Calhoun County, like a hand pressing down, and 40 or 50 people gathered in the gravel lot of the Tanner Feed and Supply, under the corrugated awning, Cecilia Voss stood in the bed of her truck with her notebook and waited for the crowd to settle. Gerald Pratt was there with his even-brimmed hat and the second consortium man with the badge that caught the light, and she saw them standing near the back with the posture of men who expect to be consulted before any decision is made. She saw Dale Tufts near the front, with his hat in his hands. She saw Fitzgundry from the feed store with his arms folded in an expression she could not read. She saw Tomas at the far edge of the crowd on the fence rail where he had first watched her goats, with his mother beside him, and she saw Orsolia Thecate near the side wall with her rubber boots and her cotton headscarf and her expression of a person watching a thing confirm itself. She opened her notebook and she said, "I want to start with some numbers." She told them that the Dillard Swamp parcel, which was the 80 acres she had purchased for $11,200 at the county tax sale 14 months ago, was the site of a functioning artesian spring fed by a limestone formation approximately 90 feet below the clay cap, producing water at a consistent 54 degrees at a rate of 9 gallons per minute and at a daily volume of just under 13,000 gallons. She said this water was clean and mineral-rich, and had been tested and documented through the County Health Department's voluntary well certification program, the paperwork for which she removed from the notebook and held up. She said this water was the reason her goats were in the condition they were in, and the reason her dairy was producing what it was producing, and the reason Rosa Iglesias drove 3 hours each way twice a month to collect product from a property everyone in this county had told her was worthless. She paused and looked at Gerald Pratt. She said, "Meridian Agricultural Consortium has offered me $31,000 for this property and has used 3 separate legal mechanisms in the past 60 days to pressure that sale, including a water board notice that I researched and determined to be without merit. I want the county to understand that Meridian's interest in this parcel is not remediation. It is this spring. I know this because when Mr. Pratt made his most recent offer to me, he described the artesian capacity of my property using numbers that I have never stated publicly, which means he has had someone on this property who should not have been on this property, or he has obtained records from the water board filing that are not yet public. Either one is a matter for the county attorney, and I have already spoken to the county attorney this morning." Gerald Pratt opened his mouth and then closed it. The second consortium man put his hand briefly on Pratt's arm, and they spoke in a short, urgent undertone. The crowd, which had been very still, made a sound like a single exhalation. She said, "I am not selling to Meridian. I was not going to sell to Meridian for $31,000, and I would not sell to Meridian for $310,000, because Meridian's plan for this spring is to meter it and bill this community for the water that is underneath this community's ground. I have the fee schedule from their county emergency water proposal, and I have run the arithmetic of what it would cost the families in this county over 10 years, and I would be glad to read those numbers aloud if there is any interest. There was considerable interest. She read the numbers. They were large numbers, and they were clear, and nobody in the crowd disputed them. She said, "What I am proposing instead is this. I am willing to extend a water pipeline from my collection basin to a distribution point on the county road right-of-way. I am willing to allow any stock operation in this county to take water from that distribution point through August and September at a cost I am setting at $1 per 1,000 gallons, which is below my actual infrastructure cost, and I am asking every person who takes water to bring 1 day's labor to the pipeline project, because I need help laying the pipe and I cannot afford to hire it done. The water is not for sale. The labor for laying the line is what I am asking, and the $1 per 1,000 after that is so that I can replace the infrastructure when it wears out." She closed the notebook. She said, "Orsolia Fekete told me last summer that the land holds a ledger and that it has been writing in that ledger longer than any of us have been watching. I believe that. This spring has been here for 30 years under land that the county wrote off as worthless. All it needed was someone willing to follow the animals to where the water was and then be patient enough to let it come to the surface in its own time. I am not standing here to tell anyone they were wrong about this property or wrong about me. I am standing here because we have a drought and we have a spring. And those two facts need to be introduced to each other before the end of the month." Dale Tufts was the first to move. He put his hat on his head and then immediately took it off again, the habitual gesture of a man removing his hat in the presence of something that deserved the courtesy, and he said, "Tell me where to start digging." Gerald Pratt and the second consortium man left the lot before the crowd began to organize. She watched them go from the truck bed. Nobody else left. Nobody laughed, or if they had once laughed, they had lost interest in that particular response entirely. Fitzgundry unfolded his arms. Thomas got down from the fence rail and came to the crowd to stand near her truck, looking up at her with the expression of a child for whom the world has confirmed a thing he always thought was true. Orsolia stayed against a side wall, and when Cecilia finally looked at her, she simply put 2 fingers to her lips, and then turned them outward, which was her gesture Cecilia had learned for something that has finished becoming what it was always going to be. The pipeline project took 11 days. 32 people showed up across those 11 days, and the labor was uneven in quality, but even in spirit, and the pipe went in. The rains came in the second week of September, which was earlier than the drought model had predicted, and later than anyone had prayed for. And they came in 3 good soaking inches across 4 days, and then a slow inch a week through the rest of the month. And by October, the county's ponds were recovering, and the pastures were greening at their roots, and the arithmetic of survival in Calhoun County looked less like a sentence and more like a ledger that was slowly and on balance coming right. The senator was 11 years old that autumn, old for a Nubian buck, and he had developed a marked preference for standing in the afternoon sun on the slight clay swell above the artesian basin, which was the highest point for a quarter mile and which gave him a view of the regrassing pastures and the pipeline, right-of-way, and the small roof of Cecilia's dairy shed that she had built in the spring. He stood there on a Tuesday in mid-October while Tomas moved the evening herd through the southern rotation, and Orsolia sat in the one chair Cecilia kept by the basin with a jar of tea and said nothing for a long time, which was Orsolia's way of saying a great many things. She finally said, "You know, in my village there was a word. We used it for the person who knows where the water is when everyone else has forgotten. It is not exactly translatable. It means something like, the one who stayed quiet while the land was whispering." Cecilia was standing at the basin with her notebook, recording the afternoon flow rate, which had not varied by more than a few hundredths of a gallon per minute across 14 months of observation. She said, "What happened to those people in the village?" Orsolia said, "They became the village." Eventually, that is how it always goes. The land decides who belongs, and the land is very patient, and it is never wrong. Cecilia wrote the afternoon's number in the notebook and closed it. The senator did not move from his swell of clay. The water came up cold and steady from the limestone below 9 gallons per minute, as it had come for 30 years under land that no one had thought worth watching. And the new grass in the regrassing pasture moved in the first thin October wind. And somewhere at the end of the pipeline, on the county road right of way, the distribution valve was closed now because the rains had come and the crisis was passing. And the county did not need her water today, but it knew where the water was. And it knew who to ask, and that was the thing that had changed, that could not be changed back.